We're now going to start working with standard form and being able to find the vertex. The method to find the vertex when your equation is in standard form is called completing the square. So completing the square takes your equation, which is in standard form, which is just 3 terms, maybe 2 terms, with no brackets, and puts it into the vertex form so that you can find the vertex, which is h and k. If you are dealing with an application problem or a word problem and you are asked to find the maximum or the minimum, you're needing to find the vertex. So if the equation given to you is in standard form and you're asked to find the maximum or the minimum, you have to use this completing the square method to put it into vertex form so you can find the vertex. So the first step is to common factor the coefficient of the x squared term, so that's the -3, from the first 2 terms only. Do not factor out the x and do not factor the third term. It's only from the first 2 terms. So what you're going to do is factor out that -3 from the first 2 terms. So when you divide -3 by -3, you just get 1. So you're just left with x squared. And when you divide -6 by -3, you get +2. Remember, it's not a full common factor because you are not taking out the x. You are only taking out the 3. So the x squared and the x still stay there. The next step is to take the coefficient of x, which is 2, divide it by 2, and then square it. Now, you are always dividing by 2. You're not dividing by 2 because that number is 2. This you always divide by 2 no matter what that number is. So whatever that number is, divide it by 2 and then square it. So we're going to take this 2, divide it by 2, and square it. So 2 divided by 2 is 1, and then 1 squared is 1. That's the next step. The third step is you're going to take that number 1, and you're going to add it and subtract it inside the bracket. So right there, after the x and before the end of the bracket, you're going to take this 1 and you're going to go +1 minus 1. So you're going to get -3 bracket x squared plus 2x plus 1 minus 1 and then +4. That's the next step. Then what you're going to do is take the last term, which is this -1, and you're going to multiply it with this -3, almost like you're doing the distributive property with just that last term. So you're going to take the -3 and multiply it by the last term to move it outside of the bracket, out here. So once again, you're going to take the last term, the -1, you're going to multiply it with the number in front of the bracket so that we can remove it from the bracket, and then it gets put over here. So that becomes so the -3 gets multiplied with the -1, and it gets moved to the outside of the brackets. So -3 times -1 is +3. And then you can add those two numbers together. So it almost looks like it's in vertex form now. The last thing you have to do is factor this trinomial. And it should be a simple trinomial because you've taken that number away from the front of the x squared. And two numbers that multiply to 1 and add to 2 are 1 and 1. If you have done this properly, the two numbers that multiply to this and add to that should be the same, so that you can write it like this. -3 bracket x plus 1 squared plus 7. So because the two numbers you found that multiplied to 1 and added to 2 were both the same, they were both 1 and 1, your two brackets would become x plus 1 and x plus 1, which you can write as x plus 1 squared. And there is your equation in vertex form. If the question asked you what is the vertex, then it would be this number with the opposite sign, -1, and then that number there's 7s. The vertex would be at -1, 7. So let's talk about why we're doing all these weird steps. So first of all, to get this equation, we need this here to be a trinomial that you can factor where both numbers are the same. It won't work. It won't make the x minus h squared, like here. It won't make the x minus h squared if the two numbers that multiply to 1 and add to 2 aren't the same. So in order to figure out what that number has to be, that's why we do this work. So taking that number, dividing it by 2, and squaring it makes this what we call a perfect square trinomial, which means the two numbers that multiply to this and add to this will be the same numbers, allowing us to do the x minus h squared. So that's why we do this part. Now, the reason why we have to do this part is because we only want a trinomial in here, but this has 4 terms. So we've got to kick this guy out of the bracket. And to kick him out of the bracket, he needs to be multiplied by the -3. Now you may ask, well, why did we put that -1 in there in the first place? Well, we needed the +1 to be able to get that perfect square trinomial. But you can't just take an equation and add 1. So if you add 1 and then subtract 1, you're basically adding 0. So you're really not changing the value of the equation. So we need this 1 to be able to get our perfect square trinomial so that we can factor it and get the same number. So we need this 1, but you can't just add 1 to an equation or else it'll change the equation. So if you add 1 and then subtract 1, you're basically adding 0. So doing this, you're basically adding 0 and not changing the value of the equation. So that's how all the steps come together and the reason why we do all these crazy steps. But it may be a bit confusing. We're taking 2 days on this. This is the first day. And usually by the end of the second day, people just get it. It becomes very natural to do these 4 steps. Or I guess 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 steps. Again, if you don't get it right away, just keep practicing. We're spending 2 days on this.